Now, I thought the 1807 Insurrection Act that he could only deploy those federal troops if they were invited or welcomed by a governor. Uh, because uh, because I mean, at least J.B. Pritzker in his statement, he said that troops would have to be invited. Now, is that not the case, or is there a loophole or some gray area that he's trying to exploit?
I wish Pritzker was right, but he's not. Um, First, if you really want to do a deep dive into this, the Constitution grants Congress the the calling forth power. It's called the calling forth clause. And Congress was the only power granted to by the Constitution to call forth the militia for any reason. But the Constitution grants Congress the discretion to delegate power. And so, what has happened over time is that Congress has delegated more and more of this power to the executive. And I'll go into the reasons why, but just as an overall view, and that's where we ended up today because the Congress and then later on the courts kept expanding that power. So, this inherent power that has been entrenched in the executive branch for so long isn't actually inherent to the executive branch. And so Congress, if it wanted to, Congress can giveth and Congress can taketh away. Congress, if had they been honorable and had the best interests of the country at heart, could meet right now and revoke that authority to call the militia. But of course, we're going to have a problem with that. But so to give you an idea, the law that Congress used to grant that power was called the Militia Acts, and there was actually a series of them that started in 1792. George Washington was president, and Congress, remember the nation's still very young, and they're basically trying things out. And so they had an honorable and trustworthy commander-in-chief in George Washington, and Congress felt comfortable enough to give him a little bit of rope. And they said, through the first Militia Act, you now have the power to call the militia to quell to repel any foreign invasion or quell domestic insurrection, but they placed some checks. He had to get authorization to do so. So he did call out the militia, which was because there was no army at that point. He called out the militia and mobilized them against American citizens to quell the Whiskey Rebellion.
Mhm.
But because George Washington was a good man, he went to the Supreme Court and he said, "This is what I plan to do. Do I have your consent?" The Supreme Court said yes. And then Congress said, "Well, you have the ability to do this, but you must first issue a proclamation." And basically, it put the rioters on notice that they would cease their activities against the laws of the United States forthwith or suffer the consequences. And once those steps were taken, then he had the authority, only then, to get the militias of several surrounding states together and go put down that rebellion. So that was the first act. Then in 1795, they rewrote the act again. And they gave the president a little bit more power because Washington acted admirably and with honor, so to speak.
Right.
So they gave the president at that point a little bit more rope, and so they limited his ability to call out the militia for 30 days, and then he had to get the authorization of Congress. But they allowed him to act unilaterally. He didn't have to go to the Supreme Court and say, "May I?" So that was one check that they threw out the window. Um, And this was used by President Adams to threaten to bring federal troops to put down Fry's rebellion. He didn't actually do it; he just threatened it.
Right.
So then, in 1807, we have the act, the Militia Act, that is better known as the Insurrection Act, which is what Trump is basing his authority on. And it did a couple of important things. First of all, it removed reference to foreign invasion, and it expressly kept the language that the president had the power to put down domestic insurrection. Now, why did Congress do that? Number one, they basically said, well, it's assumed that the president has power to repel foreign invasion. That's why he's a commander in chief. And they kept the language of that the president can call troops to quell insurrection because they wanted to drive that point home. They removed the rest of the checks on that power. They doubled his authorization to 60 days of deploying federal troops without the consent of Congress. And most importantly, it gave the executive branch or the president the sole authority to determine what emergency constituted an insurrection. And they gave the president that power because up until that time, we had only had honorable presidents that had the well-meaning of the country in mind. But think about that for a moment. Trump has the power because he comes from a long line of presidents that generally did the right thing. Trump now has the power to, number one, act unilaterally without the permission of Congress, without the permission of a state governor, without the permission of anybody, and to apply federal troops in America, but for any reason he damn well pleases. He's the sole authority. And then in 1861, the language was changed again. This was the first Civil Rights Act. It was also called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It was, of course, during this early part of the Civil War or pre-Civil War. It was specifically targeting the Ku Klux Klan, which had ties to law enforcement. Let's not forget that law enforcement in this country is racist to its core because they were first given authorization in this country under the Fugitive Slave Acts.
Yeah, they were slave catchers.
Yes. So police were literally created to hunt black men in America. It's in their institutional DNA, right? And so Congress said, well, we got to rein in this power a little bit because the Ku Klux Klan has infiltrated law enforcement. And so they gave the president even greater power. Now the president has the power to suspend habeas corpus for military arrests. So in other words, the president has the ability to put the military in force. Also, it wasn't just the militia now. Now it included the federal army because now the federal army was a thing.
Right.
And that army could basically suspend constitutional rights of American citizens in order to arrest them in response to any emergency that the president dreamed up. Now, Lincoln was president, so again, we have a president who cared about our country and wrestled with very, very difficult decisions to make and was sober judgment, and he didn't do everything right, and he wasn't a saint, but by golly, he had the best interests in mind. So he didn't, at least in our view, modern wise, he didn't abuse that. But he did things that were very, very controversial. So what he did under this 1861 act and the subsequent acts was he called a naval blockade against American citizens who were the Confederacy, but they were American citizens at that point because the Civil War hadn't started.
Mm-hmm.
We knew it was going there, but hostilities hadn't yet started. And so he called federal troops to blockade Confederate ports outside of Congress, outside of the judiciary, and that was seen as extremely inflammatory and controversial. As far as the South is concerned, President Lincoln started the war there, right?
Mhm.
And so in 1871, now past the Civil War, we're into Reconstruction. Congress tried to break things a little bit. They came out with the Posse Comitatus Act. That's what people are familiar with, where it says that federal troops, the National Guard, can't the misnomer is that they can't be deployed on U.S. soil. That's not true. Of course they can, but they're supposed to be supporting duly authorized law enforcement, not enforcing the law themselves. But guess what? Congress exempted action under the previous Militia Acts. So the Posse Comitatus Act didn't apply to federal troops that were deployed under the Militia Acts, which doesn't seem to make much sense to us in modern times, but here we are. And then going on, the federal court system steadily gave the executive branch more and more power now through court precedent. So Congress kind of pulled out of the game here. The Supreme Court in what's called the prize cases. It's a collection of admiralty suits that had to do with Lincoln's blockade.
Mhm.
Gave him a lot of power to, unilaterally call force in America. And so that actually was the basis of Padilla v. Rumsfeld. Do you remember back in 2003, Jose Padilla in Chicago was a domestic terrorist who tried to do the dirty bomb thing?
No, I don't remember that,
Yeah,
but
okay, so he was a American citizen. I believe he was a gangbanger or something, and I don't know how it happened, but he thought he got recruited by ISIS or the Taliban or whatever it is, and he was going to set off a dirty bomb in an American city,
mhm.
and he got caught, and so they used that case. Rumsfeld, of course, was uh, I think he was Secretary of Defense at that time, but they used those prize cases as the basis to basically override his civil rights as an American citizen, because the prize cases gave the president the power to designate what they called belligerents against U.S. The execution of U.S. laws. And so they kind of made an end run. So any U.S. citizen has inherent rights under our Constitution, but
Right.
they were able to basically suspend those for this guy because the president designated him as a belligerent or an enemy combatant, as GW like to call him. And so that opened the door to a whole host of civil rights abuses in the Bush and even the Obama era. So to answer the question of whether they can go in without being invited by the governor, yes, they absolutely can. President Grover Cleveland mobilized federal troops to come into Chicago in 1894 to put down the Pullman Railroad strike. And Governor Altgeld of Illinois at the time refused to allow them into Illinois, but the president overrode him and legally did so, and brought in federal troops to put down that labor strike. Now, how is a labor strike an insurrection?
Yeah.
Because the president said it was. Um,
So
and
so I
and
guess
hold on, more
yeah.
recently, Lyndon B. Johnson brought in the federalized National Guard at that time into Alabama, to Selma, Alabama, over Governor George Wallace's objections to enforce desegregation. First, to protect the Martin Luther King marches, and second, to protect African American school children to attend the newly desegregated schools. So Pritzker's wrong. The president can bring in federal troops over their objections.